Overview of RMI interfaces and classes in Java remote method invocation. My interfaces and classes. The interfaces and classes that are responsible for specifying the remote remote behavior of RMI system are defined in the java.rmi package hierarchy. The following figure shows the relationship between several of these interfaces and classes. In RMI, this is java.rmi.remote interface. In RMI, the remote interface is an interface that declares a set of methods that may be invoked from a remote Java virtual machine. A remote interface must satisfy following requirements. A remote interface must at least extend either directly or indirectly an interface java.rmi.remote. Each method declaration in remote interface or its super interface must satisfy the requirement of a remote method declaration as follows. A remote method declaration must include the exception java.rmi.remote exception for one of its superclass such as java.io exception or java.lang.exception in its throws clause in addition to any application specific exceptions. Note that application specific exceptions do not have to extend java.rmi.remote exception. In a remote method declaration, a remote object declared as a parameter or return value, either declared directly in the parameter list or embedded within non-remote object in a parameter, must be declared as a remote interface, not implementation class of that interface. And the remote exception class, the java.rmi.remote exception class is the superclass of exception thrown by the RMI runtime during remote method invocation. To ensure the robustness of applications using RMI system, each remote method declared in a remote interface must specify java.rmi.remote exception or one of its superclass such as java.io.exception or java.lang.exception in its thrown clause. The exception java.rmi.remote exception is thrown when a remote method invocation fails for some reason. Some reason for remote method invocation failures includes communication failure, the remote server is unreachable or is refusing connections, the connection is closed by the server, failure during parameter or return value marshalling or unmarshalling, protocol errors, the class remote exception is checked exception, one that must be handled by the caller of a remote method is checked by the compiler, not runtime exception. Especially the remote object class and its subclasses with related to remote reference layer. RMI server functions provided by java.rmi.server.remote object and its subclasses java.rmi.server.remote server and java.rmi.server.unicast remote object and java.rmi.activatable. The class java.rmi.server.remote object provides implementation for java.land.object methods, hashcode, equals, and toString that are sensible for remote objects. The methods need us to create remote objects and export them available to remote clients are provided by the class unicast remote object and activatable. The subclass identify the semantics of the remote reference, for example whether the server is simple remote object or is an activatable remote object, that one that executes when invoked. The java.rmi.server.unicast remote object class defined a singleton unicast remote object whose references are valid only while the server process is alive. The class java.rmi activation.activatable is an abstract class that defines an activatable remote object that starts executing when its remote methods are invoked and can shut itself down when necessary. Here you can see a remote implements remote object, and remote object extends the remote object implements remote, and remote server extends remote object, and activatable extend remote server. Unicast remote object extend remote server. Remote exception extend IO exceptions. As an example, we can consider now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.